Chapter 6, Part 2 of Gigolo by Edna Ferber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ain't Nature Wonderful? Part 2. And the next morning at 11, a very wonderful thing began to happen. Next morning at 11, Miss Jessie Heath loped, well, it can't be helped, that describes it exactly, into the broad aisles of the fifth floor. She had been coming in a great deal lately, the Western trip, no doubt. Descriptions of people are clumsy things at best, and stop one's story, but Jessie Heath must have her paragraph. A half-dozen lines ought to do it. Well, she was the kind of girl who always goes around with a couple of Airedales, and in woolen stockings, low shoes, and mannish shirts, and shell-rimmed glasses. And you felt she wore Ferris waists. Her hair was that ashen blonde with no glint of gold in it. You knew it would become grey in middle age with no definite period of transition. She never buttoned her heavy welted gloves, but wore them back over her hand like a cuff. Very English. You felt there must be a riding crop concealed about her somewhere, perhaps up her spine. As has been said, there was always a little flurry when she came into the big store that had made millions for her father. It would be nonsense to suppose that Jessie Heath ever deliberately set out to attract a man who was an employee in that store, but it is pleasant and soothing to be admired, and to have a fine pair of eyes look fine things into one's own shell-rimmed ones. And after all, the Jessie Heaths of this world are walked with and golfed with, and ridden with and tennised with, and told that they're wonderful pals. But it's the Myras that are made love to. So now, when Florian Sikes looked at her and flushed a little, and said, "I suppose there are a lot of lucky ones going along with you on this trip, Miss Jessie," she flushed too, and flicked her boot with her riding crop. No, I forgot she didn't have a riding crop. Well, anyway, she gave the effect of flicking her boot with her riding crop, and said, "Would you like to go?" Would I like to go? He choked over it. Then he sighed, and smiled rather wistfully. "That's needlessly cruel of you, Miss Jessie." "Maybe it's not so cruel as you think," Jessie Heath answered. "Did you make out that list?" "I spent practically all of yesterday on it." Which we know was a lie, because look, wasn't he with Myra? They went over the list together. Fishing tackle, tents, pocket flashes, puttees, ponchos, chocolate, quirts, slickers, matches, medicine case, sweaters, cooking utensils, blankets. It grew longer and longer. Their heads came close together over it, and they trailed from department to department, laughing and talking together. And the two Maine ex-guides, and the clerk who boasted he knew the Rockies like the palm of his hand, said to one another, "Get on to Nature's rival trying to make a hit with Jessie." Meanwhile, Jessie was saying, "Of course, you know the Rockies, being a Western man and all." Florian smiled, rather deprecatingly. "Queer part of it is, I don't know the Rockies so well," with an emphasis on the word Rockies that led one to think his more noteworthy feats of altitude had been accomplished about the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Andes, and the Lesser Appalachians. "But you've climbed them, haven't you?" He burned his bridges behind him. "Only the eastern slopes." "Oh, that's all right, then. We're going to do the West. It'll be wonderful having you." "Me?" Nothing. Let's go on with the list. Where were we? Oh, yes. Now, trout flies. Which do you honestly think best for mountain trout? The silver doctor? Or the gray hackle? Or the yellow professor? Inspiration comes to us at such times. It could have been nothing less that prompted him to say, "Well, doesn't that depend a lot on the weather and the depth of the water?" "Yes, of course. How silly of me. We'll take a lot of all kinds, and then we'll be safe." He breathed again and smiled. He had a winning smile, Florian. Jessie Heath smiled in return, and they stood there, the two of them, lips parted, eyes holding eyes. "My God," said the man who boasted he knew the Rockies like the palm of his own hand, "it looks as if he'd landed her, the stiff." Certainly, it looked as if he had. For next morning old Heath, red-faced, genial-looking, and not so genial as he looked, approached the head of the fifth floor and said, "How long you been with us, Sikes?" "Well, I came here as errand boy at 13. That's 10, 12, 15, just about 16 years next June. Yes, sir." How'd my daughter get the idea you were from the West, and a regular mountain goat, and a peak climber, and all that?" He did look a little uncomfortable then, but it was too late for withdrawal. "I am from the West, you know." "Have you had any long vacations since you've been with us?" "No, sir. You see, in the summer, of course, our busy season, I can never get away then, so I've taken my 2 weeks in the fall." Old Heath's eyes narrowed musingly. "Well, you couldn't have done all this mountain climbing before you were 13. And Jessie says—" He paused, rather blankly. "You say you do know the Rockies, though, eh?" Florian drew himself up a little. "As well as I know any mountain." "Oh, well, then, that's all right. Seems Jessie thinks you'd be a fine fellow to have along on this trip. I can't go myself. I hate this mountain climbing, anyway. Too darned hard work. But it's all right for young folks. Well, now, what do you say? Want to go? You've earned a vacation after 16 years. There's about 8 in Jessie's crowd, not counting guides. What do you say? Like to go?" For a dazed moment Florian stared at him. "Why, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'd like to go very much." And he coughed to hide his joy and terror. And 2 weeks later he went. The thing swept the store like a flame. In an hour everyone knew it, from the shipping room to the roof restaurant. Myra saw him the day he left. She was game, that girl. "I hope you're going to have a beautiful time, Mr. Sikes." "Thanks, Myra." He could afford to be lenient with her, poor little girl. She ventured a final wretched word or two. It's wonderful of Mr. Heath and Miss Heath, isn't it?" She was rubbing salt into her own wound and taking a fierce sort of joy in it. "Wonderful. Say, they're a couple of God's green footstools, that's what they are." He was a little mixed, but very much in earnest. "A couple of God's green footstools." And he went. He went, and Myra watched him go, and except for a little swelling gulp in her white throat, you'd never have known she'd been hit. He was going with Jessie Heath. Now, Myra had no illusions about those things. Old man Heath's wife, now dead, had been a girl with no money and no looks, and yet he had married her. If Jessie Heath happened to take a fancy to Florian, why... Myra's little world stood still, and in it were small voices, far away, asking for 6½B, and have you it in brown, and other unimportant things like that. 10 minutes after the train had started, Florian Sikes knew he should not have come. He had suspected it before. He kept saying to himself over and over, "You've always wanted a mountain trip, and now you're going to have it. You're a lucky guy, that's what you are, a lucky guy." But in his heart he knew he was lying. In the first place, they were all so glib with their altitudes and their packs and their trails and their horses and their camps. It was a rather mixed and raggle-taggle group that Miss Jessie Heath had gathered about her for this expedition to the West. They ranged all the way from a little fluffy, witless, golden-haired girl they called Mud for some obscure reason, and who had been Miss Heath's roommate at college, surprisingly enough, to a lady of stern and rock-bound countenance who looked like a stage chaperone made up for the part. She was Miss Heath's companion, in lieu of Mrs. Heath, deceased. In between, there were a couple of men of Florian's age, 2 youngsters of 21 or 2, who talked of Harvard and asked Florian what his university had been. An old girl whose name Florian never did learn, and 2 others of Jessie Heath's age and general style. Florian found himself as bewildered by their talk and views as though they had been jabbering a foreign language. Every now and then, though, one of them would turn to him for a bit of technical advice. If it happened to concern equipment, Florian could answer it readily enough. 10 years on the 5th floor had taught him many things. But if the knowledge sought happened to be of things geographical or of nature, he floundered, struggled, sank. And it took them just about half a day to learn this. The trip out takes 4 from New York. At first they asked him things to see him suffer, but they tired of that after a bit. It was too easy. Queerly enough, Jessie Heath, mountain-wise though she was, believed in him almost to the end. But that only made the next 3 weeks the bitterer for Florian Sikes. For when it came to leaping from peak to peak, Jessie turned out to be the young gazelle. And she liked to have Florian with her. On the trail she was a mosquito afoot, a jockey a horseback. 1,000 times in those 3 weeks of torture he would fix his eye on a tree 10 feet away up the steep trail, and to himself he would say, "I will struggle somehow as far as that tree, and then die under it." And he would stagger another 10 feet, his heart pounding in the unaccustomed altitude, his lungs bursting, his lips parted, his breath coming sobbingly, his eyes starting from his head. Leaping lightly ahead of him around the bend was Jessie, always. She had a way of calling to the laggard, hallooing, I believe it's supposed to be called, and she expected an answer. An answer? When your lungs were bursting through your chest, and your heart was crowding your tonsils? When he reached her, it was always to find her perched on a seemingly inaccessible rock, demanding that he join her to admire the view. Before 3 days had gone by, the sound of that halloo, with its breeziness and breath-control and power, made him sick all over. Sometimes she sang, going up the trail. He could not have croaked a note if failure to do it had meant instant death. The Harvard hellions, it is his own term, were indefatigable, simian, pitiless. At 9,000 feet they aimed at 10. At 10 they would have nothing less than 12. At 12,000 they were all for making another drive for it and having lunch at an altitude of 13,500. As he toiled painfully along, hundreds of feet behind them, Florian used to take a hideous pleasure in fancying how, on reaching the ever-distant top, the Harvard hellions would be missing, and, after searching and hallooing, he would peer over the edge, 13,500 feet at the very least, surely, and there, at the bottom, would discern their mangled forms, distorted, crushed, and quite dead. Yoo-hoo! Jessie up the trail. His rosy dream would vanish. He learned why seasoned mountain climbers make nothing of the ascent. He learned, in bitterness and unshed tears, that it is the descent that breaks the heart and shatters the already broken frame. That down climb, with your toes crashing through your boots at every step, with your knee brakes refusing to work, your thighs creaking, your joints spavined. The views were wonderful, but oh, the price he paid! The air was intoxicating, but what, he asked himself, was wine to a dead man? Miserable little Cockney that he was, he told himself 100 times a day that if he ever survived this, he'd never look at another view again, unless from the Woolworth Tower on a calm day. He thought of New York as a traveller dying of thirst in the desert thinks of the lush green oasis. New York in July, dear New York in July, its furs in storage, its collar unstarched, its coat unbuttoned, even its doormen and chauffeurs almost human. Would he ever see it again? And then, as if in answer to his question, there befell an incident so harrowing, so nerve-shattering, as almost to make a negative answer seem inevitable. Florian got lost. It was the third week of the trip. Florian had answered Jessie's 11,000th question about things of which he was quite ignorant. His brain felt queer and tight, as though something were about to snap. They were to climb the peak next day. All that day they had been approaching it. Florian looked at it, and he hated it. It was like a colossal, forbidding finger pointing upward, taunting him, menacing him. He wished that some huge cataclysm of nature would occur, swallowing up this hideous mass of pitiless rock. Jessie Heath's none too classic nose had peeled long ere this, and her neck was like a choice cut of underdone beefsteak. Florian told himself that there was something almost indecent about a girl who cared so little about her skin and hair, and eyes and hands. He actually hated her sturdy legs in their boots or puttees, those tireless, pitiless legs, always twinkling ahead of him up the trail. On the fateful day he was tired. He had often been tired to the point of desperation during the past 3 weeks, but this was different. Every step was torture. Every breath was pain. Jessie was a few hundred feet up the trail, as always, and hallooing to him every dozen paces. The Harvard hellions were doing the chamois ahead of her. The rest of the party were toiling along behind. One guide was just ahead, another, leading 2 horses, bringing up the rear. Suddenly, desperately, Florian knew he must rest. He would fling himself on a bed of moss by the side of the trail in the shade, near a stunted, wind-tortured timberline pine, and let the whole procession pass him, and then catch up with them before they disappeared. He stepped to the side of the narrow trail, almost indiscernible at this height, flung himself down with a little groan of relief, and shut his sun-seared eyes. The voices of others came to him. There was little conversation. He heard Jessie's accursed halloo, then the soft thud of the pack-horses' hoofs, the creak of the saddles. He must get up and follow now. In a minute. In a minute. In a... He must have slept for 2 hours. When he awoke, the light had changed, and the air was chill. He sat up, bewildered. He rose, he looked about him, called, hallooed, shouted, did all the futile, frenzied things that a city man does who is lost in the mountains, and, knowing he is lost, is panic-stricken. The trail, of course. He looked for it, and there was no trail to his town-wise eyes. He ran hither and thither, and back to hither again. He went forward, seemingly, and found himself back whence he started. He looked for cairns, for tree-blazes, for any one of the signs of which he had learned in the last 3 weeks. He found none. He called again, shrilly. A terror seized him. Terror of those grim, menacing, towering mountain masses. He ran round and round and round, darted backward and forward, called, stumbled, fell, and subsided, beaten. He had a tiny box of matches with him, but little else. He had found the trail difficult enough without being pack-burdened. Food? He bethought himself of a little blue tin box in his coat pocket. He took it out and looked at it. Its very name struck terror to his heart. U.S. Emergency Ration. It was printed on the box. Just below that he made out powdered sugar, chocolate, cocoa butter, malted milk, egg albumin, casein. Not to be opened except on command of officer. My God, he had come to this. He looked at it, wide-eyed. He was very hungry. The ration, in its blue tin, like a box of shaving talcum, had been handed to each of the party in a chorus of shouting and laughter, and now it was to save his life. He managed to pry open the box, and ate some of its contents, slowly. It was not agreeable. Dusk was coming on. There were mountain lions, he knew that. Those rocks and crevices were peopled with all sorts of stealthy, snarling, slinking, four-footed creatures. He would build a fire. They were afraid of the flames, he had read somewhere, and would not come near. Perhaps the others would see the light, and come back to find him. Curse them! Why hadn't they come before now? It was dusk by the time he had his fire built. He had crouched over it for a half-hour, blowing it, coaxing it, wheedling it. There were few twigs or sticks at this height. He was very cold. His heavy sweater was in the pack on the horse's back. Finally he was rewarded with a feeble flicker, a tiny tongue of flame. He rose from his knees and passed his hand over his forehead with a gesture of utter weariness and despair. And then he stared, transfixed. For on the plateau above him rose a great shaft of fire, the kind of fire that only Pete, the most expert among guides, could build. And as he stared, there burst out at him from behind trees, crocks, crevices, a whole horde of imps, shrieking with fiendish laughter. "Ho, ho!" laughed Jessie, and "Ha, ha!" howled the Harvard hellions. "Thought you were lost, didn't you? Gosh, you looked funny. Your face!" Florian stared at them. He did not smile. He went quietly over to his tiny camp-fire and stamped it out neatly, as he had been taught to do. He took his can of emergency ration, not to be opened except on command of officer, and hurled it far, far down the mountainside. Jessie Heath laughed contemptuously, and Florian, looking at her, didn't care. Did not care. The nightmare was over in August. Over, that is, for Florian. The rest were to do another 4 weeks of it, farther into the interior. Florian sickened at the thought of it. When he bade them farewell, he was so glad to be free of them that he almost loved them. When he found himself actually on the little jerk-water train that was to connect him with the main line, he patted the dusty red plush seat gratefully, as one who would stroke a faithful beast. When he came into the Grand Central Station, he would have stooped and kissed the steps of the marble staircase, if his porter had not been on the point of vanishing with his bags. That night, on reaching home, he stayed in the bathtub for an hour, just lying there in the warm, soothing liquid, only moving to dabble his fingers now and then as a lazy fish moves a languid fin. God's country, this was it. "My, it's nice to have you back again, Mr. Sikes," said Mrs. Pett. "Is your big 2-room suite on the next floor vacant?" said Florian cryptically. Mrs. Pett stared a little wonderingly. "Yes, that's vacant since the Ostranders left in July. Why do you ask, Mr. Sikes?" "Nothing," Florian answered airily. "Not a thing. Just asked." His train had come in at 9. It was 11 now, but he was restless and a little hungry, and very much exhilarated. "You certainly look grand," Mrs. Pett had exclaimed admiringly. "And my, how you're sunburned." He left the Lexington Avenue house now and strolled over to the nearby white-tiled restaurant. There in the window was the white-capped one, flapping pancakes. Florian could have kissed him. He sat down. A waitress approached him. "I don't know," mused Florian. "I'm sort of hungry, but I don't just—" "The pork and beans are elegant tonight," suggested the girl. And "Pork and beans? No!" thundered Florian. The girl drew herself up icily. "I ain't deef. You don't need to yell." Florian looked up at her contritely, and smiled his winning smile. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I never want to see beans again as long as I live." He was down at the store early next morning. His practised eye swept the department for possible slackness, for changes, for needed adjustments. The 2 Maine ex-guides, and the chap who knew the Rockies like the palm of his hand, welcomed him with Judas-like slaps on the shoulder. "Like it?" they asked him. And "God's country, the West," he answered mechanically. After that he ignored them. At 9 he ran down the 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor. He did not wait for the elevator. For a moment he could not find her, and his heart sank. She might be away on vacation. Then he spied her in a corner, half hidden by a rack of coats. She was hanging them up. The floor was empty of customers thus early. He strode over to her. She turned. Into her eyes there leaped a look which she quickly veiled, as had been taught her by 1,000,000 female ancestors. "I got your postals," she said. Florian said nothing. "My, you're brown." Florian said nothing. "Did you have a good time?" Florian said nothing. What? Her hand went to her throat, where his eyes were fastened. Then Florian spoke. "How white your throat is," he said. "How white your throat is." Myra stepped out then from among the coats on the rack. Her head was lifted high on the creamy column that supported it. She had her pride, had Myra. "It's no whiter than it was a month ago, that I can see." "I know it." His tone was humble, with a little pleading note in it. "I know a lot of things that I didn't know a month ago, Myra." End of chapter 6, part 2.